In the spring of 1889, in the failing silver town of Coronado Wells, high in the San Juan country of southwestern Colorado Territory, a woman of 28 stood at the back of a near-empty auction house and laid $1 on the clerk's table for a building no one else would touch. The thing she bought was a stone church, abandoned for 19 years, its front door bricked shut from the inside by men who had then walked away and never returned. The town called it a ruin and a hazard, and when it was feeling unkind, a place better left to the wind. Clara Wren called it her inheritance because the man who taught her the trade of stone had told her before he died that a wall built to keep something out is also a wall built to keep something safe. She did not yet know what waited behind those bricks. She knew only that 3 priests had laid them, that no record said why, and that for 19 years the question had been allowed to rot along with the roof, stay with this one. What she found behind that doorway was not gold, and it undid a man who believed himself untouchable, and it did so without a single shot fired. To understand why a sane woman would pay $1 for a sealed ruin, you have to go back to the man who raised her. His name was Augustus Wren, and he was not her father by blood. He had been a stonemason in the old country and then a stonemason in the new one. And he had found Clara at 9 years old in a charity house in Denver, a thin girl who could already read a wall the way other children read a primer. He took her in because a foreman he trusted had told him the girl had an eye. She did have an eye. By 12, she could tell a load-bearing source from a decorative one at 30 paces. By 16, she could lay an arch that would carry its own weight for a century. Augustus taught her everything he knew, and what he knew was a great deal. And the most important of it was not how to build, but how to read what other men had built, and why. He used to say that every wall is a confession. He said a man tells the truth in stone whether he means to or not, because stone is patient and stone remembers, and a hurried course, or a hidden cavity, or a course laid against its own grain will tell you what the builder was thinking long after the builder is dust. Clara held that saying the way other people hold Scripture. When Augustus died in the winter of 1887, of a cough that took him in 3 weeks, he left her his tools, his name, and very little else. The tools were enough. There was a 12-pound striking hammer, a set of chisels he had ground himself, a plumb bob of cast brass worn smooth at the corners, and a mortar trowel whose handle had been shaped by 40 years of his grip, and now fit hers as though it had waited for her. She carried them in a canvas roll wherever she went, and she went wherever there was work. There was not much work for a woman who laid stone. That was the plain fact of it. A foreman would look at her hands, and find a reason. So she traveled, and she took the jobs no man wanted, the chimney repointing in winter, the cellar wall in a flooded mine town, the cracked foundation under a saloon that everyone said could not be saved. She saved it. Word moved slowly, but it moved, and by the spring of 1889, a railroad surveyor she had once done honest work for sent her a letter that mentioned, almost in passing, a strange old church in Coronado Wells that the county was selling off for back taxes because no one living would claim it. The letter said the church had been sealed since 1870. It said the priests who sealed it had left the diocese the same year, and that the diocese itself had moved its seat to Durango and forgotten the place. It said the building was structurally sound, which was rare, and that the asking price was whatever anyone cared to offer, which was unheard of. Clara read that letter 4 times. Then she packed her tools and bought a seat on the narrow gauge line south, and she rode through canyon country so steep the train seemed to hang from the rock, and she came down into a valley where a dying town clung to a creek and a single gray stone church stood at the end of the only street with its front door bricked over like a tomb. The auction was held in the front room of the assay office because the courthouse roof had fallen in. The room smelled of acid and coal smoke and wet wool, and a stove in the corner ticked as it cooled. There were perhaps a dozen men in the room, and Clara, and the men stood in clusters with their hats on, trading the kind of low talk that fills the gaps between lots. The clerk was a tired man with ink on his cuffs who read the lots from a ledger in a flat county voice that expected no surprises. When he read out the lot, a parcel and a stone structure, condition poor, sold as it stands, the men laughed before he had finished the sentence. One of them stood near the stove, a heavy man in a good gray coat with a watch chain across his vest, and he turned out to be the closest thing the town had to a banker. He did not laugh loudly. He laughed quietly, which was worse, and the others took their cue from him. He said, to no one in particular and to everyone, that whoever bought that pile would be buying the privilege of tearing it down at their own expense. He said it was not a building. It was a debt with a roof. And the only honest thing about it was that it had finally stopped pretending to be worth anything. The men around him grinned and shifted their weight, and one of them said something about how the priests had known to run from it, and another said that maybe the new owner would run faster. Clara stood at the back with her canvas tool roll at her feet and her hands folded in front of her, and she let them finish. She had learned a long time ago that a person who waits out the laughing is harder to laugh at. When the room had gone quiet again, and the clerk had lifted his pen and was about to mark the lot withdrawn for want of a bid, she spoke. $1, she said. Her voice was level and carried. The clerk looked up and looked at her and looked at the men, and finding no other bid and no rule against the one before him, he wrote her name in the book in his careful clerk's hand and asked her to spell it, and she spelled it Rin. 2 letters at the end, and he wrote that too. The banker watched her the whole time with the mild, amused attention a man gives a thing that cannot threaten him. He said something to the man beside him. His voice dropped low, and they both grinned, and the man beside him glanced at Clara and away. She did not hear what was said, and she did not ask, because it did not matter yet, and she did not waste herself on things that did not matter yet. She paid her $1 to the clerk. A single coin she set on the table with a small flat sound, and she took the receipt he wrote her, and she folded it once and put it in her satchel beside the brass plumb bob where she kept the few papers that were worth keeping. Then she shouldered her tools and walked out into the thin mountain light to look at what she now owned, and the laughing started up again behind her before the door had swung shut, and she let it. The church was small and very old by the standards of that country, built of gray granite quarried from the ridge above the town. 2 courses of dressed stone for every rough one. A builder's signature she recognized and respected. Whoever had raised it had known the trade. The roof had held in part and failed in part, and birds had been living in the bell tower for a generation. The windows were boarded, and the front door, the wide arched door that should have opened onto the street, was filled solid with brick from sill to keystone, a flat red face of masonry set into the gray stone arch, like a wound that had healed wrong. She stood before it a long time. She read it the way Augustus had taught her. The brick was not local. It had been freighted in, which meant it had cost money and effort, which meant the ceiling had not been a casual thing. The mortar was lime and sand, mixed well, laid by a hand that knew what it was doing, and the bricks had been laid from the inside. She could tell because the struck joints, the smooth, finished faces of the mortar, were turned inward, toward the dark interior, not outward toward the street. Whoever sealed this door had stood inside the church to do it, had laid the last brick from within, and had then left by some other way. A man does not seal himself inside a building. So there was another door, or there had been, and it too had been closed. The question was not how they got out. The question was what they had been so determined to leave behind. Here is something worth sitting with, if you have ever been told that a thing you cared about was worthless. The town saw a ruin. Clara saw a sentence written in brick by frightened men, and she meant to read it to the end. She didn't break the wall open that first day or the second. Augustus had taught her that haste is how a mason dies, under a course he pulled too fast. She went around the building instead. She found the side door the priests must have used, a low oak door in the north wall, and it too was sealed, but with stone, not brick. Dressed granite fitted so cleanly into the old opening that from 10 feet away it looked like original wall. That was finer work than the brick. That had taken days. The men who closed this church had closed it twice over, once in haste at the front, and once with great care at the side, and the care frightened her more than the haste. She took a room at the boarding house, the only one still open, run by a widow named Esther Vance, who had buried a husband in the mine and stayed on because she had nowhere better to go. The house was clean and cold, and too large for one woman, and Esther kept most of it shut, living in the kitchen and renting the 2 front rooms when anyone came, which was seldom. She was past 60, sharp-eyed, with hands roughened by 40 years of work, and a way of looking at a person that took their measure once and did not bother to take it again. She was the only person in Coronado Wells who did not treat Clara as a fool, and Clara understood, watching her ladle beans in the lamplight, that this was because Esther had been treated as one herself for most of her life and had no taste for passing it on. On the second evening, over a supper of beans and hard bread and a little salt pork, Clara asked her what she remembered about the church being sealed. Esther set down her spoon. She was quiet for a moment, and the lamp hissed, and outside the wind came down off the ridge and worked at the loose board on the porch. Then she said she remembered the year, because it was the year of the fire at the Galena mine that had taken 9 men, including a cousin of hers, and a year a person did not forget. She remembered the 3 priests, and she remembered that they had been afraid. Not solemn, Esther said, and she said the word again to be sure Clara had it. Afraid. They had worked at night by lantern with the door shut, and a person passing in the dark could hear the tap of trowels through the wall and see the light leaking around the boards. It went on the better part of a week, and after they finished, she said, they had gone down to the assay office, the same room where you bought the place, and they had signed something, and then they had saddled up and ridden out before dawn down the south road, and no churchman had ever come back to that valley. The diocese moved its seat to Durango that same year and let the building stand as it was. Folks said it was haunted. Folks will say that about anything they're afraid to think about plainly. Clara asked what they had signed. Esther said she did not know, that the signing had been a private thing, but that the man who had taken their signatures was still alive and still in the county. His name was Harlan Pruitt. He had been a young clerk in 1870, a thin, quick fellow with good handwriting, and he owned the bank now, and the freight line, and the better part of the valley, and he was no longer thin. Clara remembered the heavy man in the good gray coat who had laughed quietly at her dollar by the stove. She asked if that was him. Esther said it was, and her mouth went flat. She said in a lower voice that no one in Coronado Wells crossed Harlan Pruitt. The people who had tried over the years had a way of losing things. First, their water rights, by some clause no one had noticed in a paper they had signed years before. Then their credit at the bank, which was Pruitt's bank. Then, in the end, their land. all of it perfectly legal, all of it written down somewhere in Pruitt's own books in Pruitt's own good hand, so that when a man went to complain, there was always a document that said he was wrong and he had agreed to it. He had never raised a hand to anyone, Esther said. He had never needed to. He had paper, and paper in this valley did what guns did in worse places. She looked at Clara across the lamp and said that a woman who had just bought a thing Pruitt had laughed at might do well to be quiet about whatever she found in it. Clara said she was generally quiet. Esther said she had noticed and almost smiled, and that was the end of the talking for that night. That night, Clara lay awake and turned the thing over. A church sealed by frightened priests, a document signed before dawn, a man who ruled a valley with ledgers and never with violence. She did not yet see how the pieces fit. She only knew, with the certainty Augustus had given her, that the wall would tell her if she read it carefully enough, and that she would have to open it to read the last page. She began on the third morning at the side door, because the stone there was the finer work, and the finer work is the more honest. She did not swing the hammer at it. Augustus had taught her that the first thing a mason does to a wall she means to open is nothing at all but look. And so she looked, crouched before the low oak opening that the priests had filled with dressed granite, until she had read every joint and knew the order in which the blocks had gone in. A wall is laid in a sequence, and it can only be unmade in the reverse of that sequence, and a mason who guesses the order wrong will bring the whole face down on her hands. Clara did not guess. She found the joint the priest mason had closed last, the final block of his careful patch, the one keystone that locked all the others, and she set her smallest chisel to that single joint and began. She worked it for the better part of a day. She did not strike. She tapped, a light, steady tap with the heel of the hammer, letting the steel walk down the line of the joint and find the seam of lime that 19 years had made brittle. The work was slow past the patience of most people, and that was exactly why most people could not do it. She tapped, and the dust fell in a fine pale thread to the grass. She tapped, and the joint widened by the breadth of a hair, no more. She tapped, and her shoulder ached, and the sun moved across the church wall, and she kept on, because the wall was old, and the lime was tired, and tired lime yields to patience the way it never yields to force. By late afternoon, the keystone block had shifted in its bed, a quarter inch, then half. She set the chisel aside and worked it with her fingers in the flat of her palms, rocking it, easing it, and at last she drew it out whole and laid it on the grass as gently as if it were a sleeping child. Behind it was darkness, and out of the darkness came the smell of air that had been shut away from the world for 19 years. It was a cold smell, and dry, and old, with no rot in it because nothing living had been left inside to rot. Only the smell of stone and dust and lime and time. It was the smell of a room where the clock had stopped. She knelt before the small black opening and didn't put her hand inside. She had opened a way into the church, and she found she was not ready to enter it, and she was not ashamed of that, because a person ought to feel the weight of a sealed place before she breaks its seal. She did not go in that day. She widened the opening one stone at a time over the next 2 days, and she numbered each block in white chalk as she drew it. 1, 2, 3. A number on the stone and the same number marked on the grass where she laid it in order, because a mason who cannot rebuild what she opens is only a wrecker, and Clara had been raised to build. The labor was hard and exact and lonely. Her hands cracked at the knuckles, and she wrapped them in strips of clean cloth and went on. On the 4th day, a boy from one of the valley families, a thin, watchful child of about 10 named Tomas Ibarra, came and sat on the broken wall across the lane and watched her work without a word. And she let him, because the young are the only ones who watch patient work without growing bored, and because she had been such a child once herself. And on the 5th day since she had bought the church for $1, Clara Wren lit a lantern, ducked through the low opening she had made, and stepped into the sealed church. The lantern light fell first on the floor, and the floor was the first wrong thing. It was clean. Not clean as a kept room is clean, but clean as a thing is clean when no living foot has crossed it. The dust lying even and undisturbed over everything. A gray snow that had fallen for 19 years and been troubled by nothing. Her own boots left the first prints since the priests had left theirs. She held the lantern high. The pews stood in their rows. The altar stood at the east end under a window boarded from outside so that not a thread of daylight came through. And on the walls, where there should have been plaster and perhaps a painted Station of the Cross, there was something she did not at first understand. The walls had been written on, not defaced. Written carefully in a neat clerical hand, in lamp-black ink that had not faded in the dark, column after column of names and numbers running from the altar all the way to the bricked front door. Clara walked the length of the north wall with her lantern, reading, and what she read were names of men and women, and beside each name a parcel of land described in the old way by metes and bounds, and beside that a date, and beside that a sum of money. It was a ledger. Someone had turned the inside of a church into a ledger, written in ink on consecrated stone, and then sealed it so that no one would ever read it. She did not understand it yet. She understood only that it was a record of something large, hundreds of entries, and that it had been hidden with enormous care, and that the care was the point. A thing written to be read doesn't get bricked behind a wall. A thing written to be hidden, but too sacred or too dangerous to destroy, gets sealed in a church by men who then flee before dawn. Clara stood in the cold and the dust and felt the whole shape of it begin to turn toward her, the way a heavy stone turns when you have finally found its balance point. I want to stop here for one breath, because the next part is the heart of it, and you should come to it knowing what it cost her to read. She read for 3 days. She brought in candles and a folding stool, and Esther's old shawl against the cold, and she copied the walls into a bound book she bought from the mercantile. Every name, every parcel, every date, every sum. The work was slow because the hand was small and the light was poor, and her own hand cramped around the pencil. But as the entries accumulated in her book, a pattern rose out of them the way a face rises out of fog. The dates clustered in the late 1860s. The parcels were all in this valley and the next, and every single entry ended the same way, with a sum of money and then 2 words in the clerical hand, paid and recorded, or else 4 words that chilled her worse, lost for non-payment, reverted. She came to understand that she was reading the true history of how the valley had been taken. In the years after the war, the diocese had served as a kind of bank for the settlers of that country, a safe place to lodge a deed, to record a sale, to borrow against a season's hope. The priests had kept the records, and the records had been honest. And then someone had begun to alter them. Not the priests. A clerk, a young man with access to the diocese's books and an arrangement with no one Clara could yet name, who had over several years quietly changed the recorded sums, marked paid debts unpaid, marked living claims reverted, and fed parcel after parcel into the hands of a syndicate that bought distressed land cheap and held it. The church ledger on the stone was the priest's answer. When they discovered the fraud and could not undo it through a county that the syndicate already half owned, they had done the only thing 3 frightened honest men could do. They had copied the true record, the real sums and the real owners, onto the one surface no one could quietly alter or burn, the stone walls of God's own house, and they had sealed it away to wait for an honest reader. Then they had run, because the men they had crossed did not forgive. The clerk's name was not written on the wall, but the pattern of the parcels was, and Clara had spent 5 days in a town that all flowed in the end to one man. She did not need the wall to tell her who the clerk had been. She needed it to prove it. And the wall, she realized, did exactly that. Because at the foot of the north wall, below the last entry, in a different and shakier hand, one of the priests had written a final note. It named the years of the fraud. It named the diocese's own internal account numbers, and it said that the original altered ledgers, the paper ones, had not been destroyed but hidden, sewn into the lining of the altar itself, against the day a court might be found honest enough to compare the false paper to the true stone. Clara set down her pencil. She looked at the altar which she had not touched, out of a respect that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the dead. Then she crossed to it, and she found the seam in the cloth that lined its underside, and she opened it with the smallest blade she carried, and inside, dry and intact, were 3 leather-bound ledgers, the diocese's own books for the years 1866 through 1869. Every altered page still bearing the erasures and the overwritings a careful eye could read. She held in her 2 hands the paper lie, and she had on the walls behind her the stone truth, and between them was 19 years and $1, and the whole weight of what Augustus had taught her. A wall is a confession. She had read it to the end. Now comes the question of what a person does with such a thing, and this is where Clara showed what she was made of. She did not go to Harlan Pruitt. She did not confront him on the street or in his bank or write him a letter. He was a man of paper, and you do not beat a man of paper by shouting at him. You beat him with better paper, read by the right eyes in the right room. So she went carefully. She took her copied book and the 3 ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a strap, and she did not trust the county at Coronado Wells, because the county was Pruitt's, and a record laid before a clerk Pruitt owned would be a record that quietly vanished. She rode the narrow gauge 2 days north, up out of the valley and over the divide, and down to the territorial land office at Del Norte, where the registrar was a dry, exact old man named Whitfield, who owed nothing to anyone in the San Juans, and cared about nothing in this world but the integrity of a record. He was the sort of man who alphabetized his own pantry. He had held his office through 3 governors because no one had ever caught him in an error or in favor, and Clara had chosen him for exactly that reason. She laid it all before him on the long oak counter of his office, the morning light coming gray through the high windows. She did not accuse anyone. She had learned from watching Pruitt that the loudest voice in a room is rarely the one that wins. She simply opened the 3 diocese ledgers to the altered years and set them on the counter, and then she opened her own copied book to the matching entries, the true sums recorded on the church wall, and she set the 2 side by side, and she stepped back and let the columns sit there and do their own work. For a long while, Whitfield said nothing. He bent over the books with a glass, his finger moving down one column and then the other, and Clara watched his jaw tighten as he understood what he was looking at. The same entry written 2 ways, the paper one altered, the stone one true. Then he straightened and asked her the question a careful man must ask. How could she be sure the wall was the original record, and not itself a forgery laid down recently to discredit an honest man? He did not say Pruitt's name. He did not have to. It was the right question, the only question that mattered, and Clara had the answer because she was a Mason and not a lawyer, and she gave it plainly. She told him that lamp-black ink, laid on lime-washed stone, oxidizes and binds into the surface across years in a way no fresh hand could imitate, that the ink on those walls had sunk into the grain of the stone for nearly 2 decades, and would show its age under any glass he cared to bring and any chemist he cared to send. She told him that the brick which had sealed the front door bore mortar that any working mason in the territory could date to within a few years by its weathering, its lime content, and the set of its crystals, and that she would stake her trade on its being 19 years old and not 1 year less. The wall could not lie about its own age, she said. The paper could lie, and had. She offered to bring 3 independent masons from 3 different towns to examine the seal and swear to it under oath, each without speaking to the others, so that their agreement could not be arranged. Whitfield looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite respect and not quite surprise. The look of a man who had spent 40 years learning that the truth is almost always the boring, verifiable, physical thing, and who had just met someone who knew it too. He asked her what she wanted out of it. She said she wanted the records set right and the land returned to the names that owned it. He asked if she wanted any of it for herself. She said she had what she wanted, which was a church she had paid $1 for. And he wrote that down too, because Whitfield wrote everything down. Then he closed the ledgers and he told her to leave them and the book with him under signed receipt. And he said he would begin in the morning. He believed her. A man like that does not say so in words. He says so by opening the file. What followed was not dramatic, and that was its own kind of justice. There was no trial in the way the dime novels would have it. No public unmasking, no villain dragged into the square. There was instead a quiet and thorough process, the slow grinding of an honest office once it has been pointed at a lie. The Territorial Land Office reopened the records for the valley. Surveyors were sent. The false ledgers were compared, page by page, to the true record on the church wall, which was photographed and sworn to, and entered into evidence exactly as Clara had said it could be. And one by one, over the better part of a year, the parcels that had been stolen by ink were restored to the names the stone remembered. Harlan Pruitt was never arrested, and Clara never saw him again. That was not how such things ended for such men, and she had not wanted it to be. What happened to him was worse, in the way that mattered. The foundation of his fortune, the falsified record on which 40 years of accumulation rested, was pulled out from under him not by violence but by verification. And a man whose only weapon is paper has no defense when the paper is shown to be false. The syndicate dissolved. The land reverted, this time honestly. Pruitt's credit, which he had used to ruin so many, evaporated when the men who had extended it understood what the records now showed. He left the valley within the year, an old man with a thin coat and a thinner reputation, and the town that had feared him discovered that it had never needed to. He simply became irrelevant, undone by the weight of what 3 priests had buried in stone, and 1 woman had been patient enough to read. The restoration took longer than the ruin had taken to make, as restoration always does. Clara stayed. She had not meant to, but the work held her. There were descendants in the valley, sons and daughters and a few of the original owners still living, who came to the land office at Del Norte to have their names written back into the record, and some of them came afterward to Coronado Wells to see the wall that had saved them. They came in 1s and 2s, hat in hand, and Clara let them in by the side door and gave them the lantern and stood back, because the wall was not hers to interpret for them. It belonged to the names on it. One of these was an old woman named Refugio Ibarra, the grandmother of the watchful boy Tomas, who had sat on the broken wall and observed Clara work. Refugio's father had lost 200 acres of good bottomland along the creek to a reverted for non-payment that had never been true, and the loss had broken him, and he had died on rented ground a mile from the fields his own hands had cleared. She came on a cold afternoon, and Clara gave her the lantern and showed her the north wall, and the old woman walked along it slowly with the light held up, her lips moving, until she found the entry. She read her father's name in the priest's neat hand, and beside it the parcel by metes and bounds, and beside that the sum, and the 2 words that the priests had written that were the truth, paid and recorded. And she wept without sound. She put her hand flat against the cold stone where the name was written, and she held it there a long moment, and she said only that her father had told her until the day he died that he had paid that debt and been cheated of his ground, and that no one in the valley had believed him, not the county, not the bank, not in the end even his neighbors, who had grown tired of a poor man's grievance. Now the wall believed him, she said. Now the wall had always believed him. For 19 years in the dark it had said his name and waited. Clara stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that the stone had not already said better, and because she had learned from Augustus that the deepest work a person does is often best honored by silence. After a while, Refugio took her hand from the wall and folded it back into her shawl, and she thanked Clara. And Clara said the thanks belonged to the 3 frightened men who wrote it down, and to the old woman's father, who had been right the whole time, and lived and died without the comfort of being believed. The county tried, belatedly, to take the church back, once it understood what the building was worth as evidence and as a kind of shrine. Clara had bought it for $1, and the dollar held. The receipt in her satchel, folded beside the brass plumb bob, was the one piece of Pruitt County paper that had ever been honest, and it made her the lawful owner of the most important wall in the San Juans. She did not sell. She did not charge admission, though she might have. She repaired the roof herself over 2 summers, recut and reset the bell tower stones, and she opened the side door, the low oak door in the north wall, so that anyone who wished could come in and read the names. The front door she left bricked. The town asked her why, and she said that the brick was part of the record too, that it told the truth about the men who had been afraid, and that some confessions are best left standing. She lived out her working life in that valley, the woman who had paid $1 for sealed ruin and opened it with her hands. She took on apprentices in time, 2 girls and a boy from the valley families, and she taught them what Augustus had taught her, that every wall is a confession, that haste is how a mason dies, that the trade is not the building but the reading, and that the patient hand outlasts the powerful one. She was never wealthy. She had given the discovery away, parcel by parcel, to the names that owned it, and kept for herself only the church and the tools and the satisfaction, which she found was enough. Augustus Wren had told her, the winter he died, that a wall built to keep something out is also a wall built to keep something safe. She had not understood him then. She understood him in that valley. Every day she walked into the cold church and read the names the priests had saved. The men who sealed that door had been afraid, and rightly, but fear had made them careful, and careful had made them honest, and their honesty had waited 19 years in the dark for a hand that knew how to open it without breaking what it held. Have you ever known a truth that no one would believe and waited a long time to be proven right? If you have, then you know what Refugio Ibarra felt with her hand against the stone. The last image of Clara Wren that the valley kept was an ordinary one. On a cold morning late in her life, she was seen walking from the boarding house to the church with her canvas roll of tools over her shoulder, the 12-pound hammer, and the chisels, and the brass plumb bob worn smooth, going to repoint a joint that the winter had loosened in the north wall, near the bottom, near the name of a man who had paid his debt and been believed at last. She let herself in by the side door. She set the brass plumb bob against the wall to find true, the way Augustus had shown her 40 years before, and she went to work, and the cold, sealed air of that safe place settled around her like something kept.